At the end of the last section, when we were talking about REMs, we mentioned how useful it is to have these styling choices that will look good on a variety of different sort of base font sizes, so that something that looks good on a desktop can also look good on a mobile device. Um,
Exactly. And in the previous section, we actually also talked about using relative font sizes for things like widths and margin and padding and why it might not be a good idea because it then is basing the size of these elements off of the line height of font, which is a weird thing.
yeah.
Um, and so, one set of new values that everyone should get to know and love is the
Hmm.
view height and view window. And what these allow you to do is instead of something crazy like setting the size of a box off of the font size, it lets you set the size of a box based on the size of the browser window. It's amazing that this is a new addition to the world of CSS within the last few years
Yeah.
because this seems like one of those things that should have been one of the first ones that was there. I mean,
Yeah,
it
I'd never heard of these until this tutorial.
yeah, it's one of those things that like you would imagine one of the first things that you'd want to do is say like, "Oh, I want this element to be half the size of the browser window. No matter what else is going on the
Right.
page, just half the size of the window." And it just wasn't supported for a long time.
Yeah. So these two new relative sizing methods are VH, which is viewport height, and VW, which is viewport width. And we're going to look at an example here. Lee, how do these work?
So they work a lot like percentages, but because CSS is weird, um, you know, they have kind of their own way where each whole unit, so one VH is 1% of the height of the viewport.
Okay.
So three would be 3%. So it works like a percent, but so did the M's, but M's were, based on a one scale where one was 100%. So
Right.
everything in CSS is always kind of screwy. You'd imagine that at
Yeah.
some point they'd be like, well, if we're going to use, 0 to 100 to represent 0 to 100%, let's just do that everywhere. But nope,
Right.
some things it's 0 to 1, and you have to go into decimals.
Yep. All right. Well, let's look at an example of this. We're going to use a new section. We're going to add a new section called the hero section.
Hmm.
And we're going to give this, what is this? It's going to be a couple classes, right?
Yes.
So we'll see how these get used. It's full hero with a hyphen,
Yep.
and then
Hero home.
hero home. And when you want to, I'm going to cut this div. We're going to put just this here,
Hmm.
indent it, and then paste it in. Should I have a space here, do you think, or should I do that? Which do you prefer?
You can add a space there just to visually separate it. I like doing that.
All right,
And
so we've got this. Now let's look at some hero styles.
exactly, let's
And
throw in a
where do
little
we,
styling for this. And
yeah, where do we want to put these?
well, it should have its own section.
Right, so should
And
it
it should
be,
be towards the top because we're going to actually end up using this hero across the site. And in case you're not familiar with the term, when you go
oh
to a
yeah, this
website,
this is a weird term. Yeah, I didn't
yeah,
know this until fairly recently.
well, they've been called a whole bunch of things over time.
Hmm.
Again, nomenclature always changes.
Yeah,
Currently, it's popular to call them heroes. Sometimes they're called billboards, other things like that, or splashes. It's when you go to a website and there's a big image or section at the top of the page
hmm.
that kind of fills the page. That's a hero.
Okay,
So we're going to reuse this on different parts of the site. So it should be up by the social styles
yeah,
because
should
that's
we,
kind of where we're putting elements that get reused across the site and aren't
right,
germane to just one page.
should it be before or after, do you think?
It could be either.
Okay, pick one.
Let's put it before.
Okay. Okay. And what are our styles going to be? I guess we're just styling the full hero class at this point, right?
Right. And that's short for full screen hero is
Okay.
what the thought was behind that. And so we're going to give it a background color and we're going to give it a height. We should also remove the height 800 pixels from the body while we're at it right now.
Okay. All right, let's take a look at that. Okay.
There you go. The beginnings.
Yeah, it's interesting, but now it looks like there's some space around here. It's not
Yeah,
very
let's get rid
attractive.
of that before we talk about exactly what's going on with the view height unit.
Okay.
So what that is that's default margin and padding
Mm-hmm.
from the browser. So by default, on just a blank HTML page, it tries to keep the content away from the edges. We're now going to remove that. So
Okay.
Michael, if you add HTML and then comma right in front of that body where we just removed
Ah,
that style,
right here.
yep, and then add in margin 0 and padding 0.
Ah, and then we've got the
Also add
H1.
H1 margin top. And actually, so comment that out. Let's first look at the margin and padding where
Right.
we remove it from the default HTML styling. So when you do that,
Ah, yeah.
notice everything went away, but there's still a margin on the top.
Yeah.
And this is something we'll discuss later in the tutorial when we talk about what's called margin collapsing.
Mm-hmm.
But what's happening is there's a default margin top on the H1, and it's actually bleeding through the parent container and pushing the whole parent container away from the top of the browser. So if we want to get rid of that and have this full hero really expand to touch all the edges of the browser, we'll, yeah, exactly, kill that margin top, and boom,
Ah, yeah.
there we go.
Great.
So now what's happened is it has a height of 50 view height, which means 50% of the viewport window. So
Okay.
if we look at the browser, that
Yeah.
blue box is 50% of the height of the whole
Right.
browser window.
And how did you find this color here? Use a color picker?
I used a color picker and did exactly what we did the last time that we picked a blue, which was
Okay.
just pick something that was like a nice neutral blue, and there
Okay.
it is.
That's great. All right. So 50 VH is a 50% of the viewport height. And again, I did not know about this when we started out on this tutorial. So this is a really useful little bit of extra knowledge. It's especially useful for mobile. Is that right?
Exactly. So there's a lot of times on mobile where, because there's a proliferation of different device sizes, you just want to say take up the full height or the full width of whatever it's on, whatever
Yeah.
size device. So this is an easy way to set your elements to be a very specific percentage of the thing. Just to take a look, Michael can also add a view width to the full hero if you were to add like width 75 VW on full hero,
Okay. Like here.
uh-huh, just to see how it goes for the other direction. And just like you'd expect, takes up 75% of it.
Yeah.
I mean, makes sense, but
Right.
it's nice to see it. And it's
So
always
how's this? Yeah.
so
Go
if
ahead.
you were to resize the browser window, that would change. So if you want to open up another one so
Right.
that we don't
Yeah.
lose the size of it, so it's always that proportion. So as you make it bigger or smaller, it's going to resize.
So how's that different from the percentage being 75%?
So the percentage we mentioned, it was based on the parent container, and it needs real values that are in there somewhere.
Ah,
So this is totally just based on the size of the window. So
got it.
if you put something way down the page contained in parent containers and whatever, but give it a height or width using view height or view width, it'll
Right.
always be based off the size of the browser.
Got it. So it's got a sort of a global setting that's based on what the user is actually looking at.
Right. So it's
Cool.
almost like an absolute value in that,
Yeah.
but it's also relative in that it can change with the size of the browser.
All right. We had another example here. We actually changed a font.
Right.
There's an H1 font change. That's right here.
Mm-hmm. So this is one of those cool things
Okay, so
about
7% of the viewport width.
right.
So
And
that's
that's
up here.
7%. This is a little tricky.
Okay.
So that it's 7% of the width is the height of the font. So
Oh, okay.
font sizes are always a little screwy because
That's weird.
font sizes are always based on the height of the font. So you're taking a width measurement and converting it to a height. But the cool thing here is that this font will now automatically resize based on the size of the browser window.
Okay, so let's
So
take a look at that again.
this sort of
Yeah, look at
thing
that.
was impossible to do. Like you would have to use actual JavaScript programming to do this sort of
Wow.
responsive styling. And this is a huge, huge benefit having this in CSS now for mobile
Right.
site design.
Yeah, so we'll be talking about that later in the tutorial, but that's really useful. Cool.